Hello, norovirus, coronavirus, influenza, and RSV, which is another seasonal virus. NHS bosses are lumping those four things together in a thing they're calling the Quad-demic, which they say is a massive, massive risk to the NHS right now. We will uncover what is going on this episode of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast. Well, here in the studio is BBC Health Editor Hugh Pym. Hello, Hugh.
Hi, Adam.
And also joining us down the line is Nick Hulme, who's Chief Executive Officer of the East Suffolk and North Essex NHS Foundation Trust. Hello, Nick.
Good evening. Hello.
So, Hugh, do you want to just explain to us what this phenomenon of the Quad-demic is?
Yeah, well, it was described as a quad-demic in the figures last week, and it's now, in addition, being called a tidal wave of flu. But the four viruses for the Quad-demic are flu, COVID, RSV and Norovirus. And flu's the real worry at the moment. The latest figures today, we get these winter sit reps every Thursday with updated figures, and we get the monthly statistics on the general performance of A&E. 1,900 beds in England occupied by flu patients last week, up 70% on the week before. Now, I was checking the daily numbers that we get. Back on November the 25th, it was 859. And as of December the 8th, it was up to more than 2,000. And I think this is the real worry, and Nick will no doubt have a view about how things are progressing at the hospitals that he's running. But this is an early flu wave. Now, it could subside in the normal way, or it could peak much higher and actually continue into the really difficult time in January. And looking back 2 years, last year it was relatively mild, the flu season. 2 years ago, you had this peak just before New Year. And I remember really chaotic scenes at some hospitals with ambulances queuing outside, real difficulties for patients in A&E. Norovirus is also a problem for hospitals. That's gone up a lot. COVID is there or thereabouts, maybe not nearly as high as it has been at times. And RSV is seen as a problem. So it's all these respiratory conditions.
And just remind us what RSV is. Well, it's respiratory syncytial virus, isn't it?
That's right.
It's basically,
you pronounce it better than me.
Yeah, although it's not spelt that way, is it? And it's just another one of these winter viruses that we can predict will spread, but it's just, and circulate. It's just not. We're not very sure what the level will be.
It's coughs and colds, and there's a lot of it out there.
Okay, right. So, Nick, I'm always conscious that when we talk about hospitals and the health service, it can sound a little bit abstract. So just paint a picture of what those numbers we were hearing from Hugh actually mean on the ground, as it were.
Thank you. So, the biggest challenge we've got is actually managing the whole kind of infection control issues that these viruses cause. So although the numbers are relatively low, so if you look across Ipswich and Colchester Hospital I'm responsible for, we've got 17 patients with COVID spread pretty evenly between the two. The flu numbers are a bit higher. They're up at 36, again, spread evenly. And RSV is about 10, 5 on each. It's not so much the people, and clearly for the patients themselves, particularly the flu, it's a really, really serious illness, particularly if you've got an underlying condition or comorbidity. So it's not so much the fact that those patients themselves cause specific issues. It's more the logistics, or like the impact of those patients. So because we've got those patients spread, because they have to be isolated, and if we find that somebody has tested positive for flu and they've been in a bay with other patients, all those patients are then contacts, we need to move them out. So on top of that, we've then got 66 beds closed at the moment across both sites that we can't use because there is a risk of infection because patients are in those bays and they've got an infected patient in the bay and therefore we can't really use the rest of the beds. Now, as Hugh was saying earlier, the scenes of ambulances queued up, the challenge on our elective list, the planned patients, the operations that we've got booked, again, addressing that massive waiting list that we know a lot about, means that it just impacts every single aspect of the hospital.
Well, we'll come on to that in a second. I'm just intrigued about for the infection control, the huge number of beds you have to basically just close off. Is there another way that could mean you either close off fewer beds or those patients are in a place where there's less of a knock-on impact? Because that seems to me like a huge number.
It is, and the challenge is, of course, that both Ipswich and Colchester hospitals are relatively old, so they don't meet the kind of standards that we expect now, where at least 30% of each ward is a single room. So the absence of single rooms, and of course we put our patients with infections in single rooms, but anybody, for example, with an undiagnosed diarrhea will go into a single room, anybody with norovirus will put in a single room, and of course the flu and everything else. But there is a limited number of single rooms. Now, were these hospitals to have been built now, they would have that much higher number because they're that much older. And we've talked before about the real problems we've had about that lack of capital investment in the NHS for many years, means we're not building new hospitals to those new regulations.
And I suppose, Nick, your nightmare is that a potentially old and very, very vulnerable person comes in with flu and they give it to another old, very, very vulnerable person who's in the hospital for something else. That's the nightmare you're trying to avoid.
Absolutely. And of course, we push vaccination both for our staff, again, the potential for our staff passing on flu. So we push very hard to vaccinate for flu. And, flu it's a serious illness as well. It's, I think people misdiagnose themselves as having flu, as we know, but it's a very serious condition. But the knock-on impact of managing the infection control, despite what we learned during COVID and everything else, is a really, really big challenge. We can't always diagnose people right at the front door. And we found, for example, recently that somebody, by the time they got to the ward, there were several contacts. And a contact needs to be isolated as well.
Oh, so what are the lessons that we all learned during COVID in 2020 that we've forgotten then?
So I think the first, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you don't see people washing their hands as much as they used to. You see people sneezing. You don't see people wearing masks and everything else. I'm not suggesting for a minute we go back to the days of what mask wearing, but just some of those basic hygiene issues around hand washing, keeping a distance. If you haven't got that sniffle or flu, stay away from work or stay away from particularly vulnerable relatives. The vaccination figures aren't quite where we need them to be at the moment, even for the elderly and for people with long-term conditions, the more vulnerable, who are more likely to become seriously ill if they get infected either with COVID or flu. I think, as Hugh was saying, the COVID numbers are still relatively small and not causing a significant challenge. The concern I have, though, Adam, is that this is very, very early. We have seasonal variation in the NHS. We see that. We kind of plan for that. We don't really plan for flu until after Christmas. So coming now, let's hope it's just an early tidal wave and it will basically settle down in January when we see those real pressures.
Yeah, hope doesn't seem like the strongest medicine, I would say, though. Hugh, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to pick up on Nick's point about buildings, capital spending. I spent some of the day this week at St Helier Hospital in southwest London. Now, most of the buildings are pre-1948, pre the foundation of the NHS. They've been lobbying for a while for new hospital buildings. They were in that 40 hospital original starter list back in 2019. The chief exec said, we're going to get it's part of Epsom and St Helier Trust, we're going to get a new hospital here. It still hasn't happened. And because it's built for patient numbers, 30 or 40 years ago, it is so cramped, A&E. Therefore, there are trolleys all around the different corridors, and that's to allow ambulances to get back on the road. So the care is said to be safe, but I can't tell you how crowded and difficult it was to run an A&E in that sort of environment. So their plea is that this new hospital programme for some hospitals is really important.
Yeah, Nick, on that issue of people being treated in the corridor, I mean, do we maybe just have to get used to the fact that some people will have to be put in a corridor for a bit of their NHS experience? And it might look awful, but it might just be the new reality.
I think it is sadly the reality at the moment. We simply don't have the capacity in the hospitals always to manage patients in areas that are designed for inpatient care, so additional beds on wards and patients on corridors. We absolutely have to make sure that the quality of care, although the patient experience is poor, we recognise that. But we need to make sure that the risk to patients is no greater. But equally, we mustn't become complacent. Now, there's more we can do. We could become more efficient, more productive in hospitals. We could have better systems internally to create better discharge planning. It's also a whole system issue. We need to make sure that our partners in social care and in primary care are able to take sicker patients perhaps a little bit earlier or not admit so many patients. The reality of corridor care is probably there for a while, but it's not just about building more buildings. Yes, we do need more general acute beds, probably right across the NHS. But there's a lot that we can do as well. So it's a balance between the pressure we put on ourselves around efficiency and productivity, maintaining quality and safety at the heart of everything we do, but also looking at, so if you look at, for example, on our Colchester site, Colchester is one of the largest growing cities in Europe. We've been given no additional resource in the last 8 years to build new beds, despite the fact the population has grown by over 30,000. So we need a conversation with local authorities, with house builders, with everybody to make sure that as we grow these cities, and we've heard a lot about new house building just in the last 24 hours, we need to make sure we've got the right health and care infrastructure to support those new houses.
And Nick, it's really good to hear from you just how the whole system works, because there's lots of components here. And I think I've become quite used to hearing people saying, oh, the problem with social care, so delayed discharges, getting people out of hospital when they could leave. And as Hugh was saying a few Christmases ago, we had the ambulance handover thing. Is there another pinch point in the system that's maybe less famous than those two that needs to be addressed?
So I think it is the responsibility of the hospitals, and this may be not a particularly popular thing to say to some of my other chief exec colleagues, but if you look at the volume and the activity that goes through our two sites at Ipswich and Colchester, if we reduce the length of stay for every patient by half a day, it would create 44 beds. Right. So, that's literally people going home 4.5 hours earlier. So we need to look at our internal systems. Are we doing the ward rounds early enough in the day to make a decision to get a patient home? Are they waiting for the drugs? Are they waiting for paperwork? Are we making sure they're reviewed at the weekend so somebody's fit to go home on Saturday morning, goes home on Saturday morning and doesn't go home on Monday afternoon because we haven't got the staff? Now, that's the challenge to me and the colleagues, and we're not awash with new staff that are coming in to address some of those issues. But I think we need to be clear about where the responsibility and the accountability sits. And there is more that we can do in hospitals. There is clearly more we can do in social care. There's more we can invest in primary care. We'll see what comes out of the 10-year plan. But that shift out of hospital is really important, because the hospital simply will not be able to manage that growth, that demand of patients, more elderly patients, frail patients, comorbidities for the next few years.
But Nick, the things that you suggested there that could make a massive difference sound to my amateur ears like quite simple things. Why is it so hard to get them in place?
I always say that running hospitals is really, really simple. It's just not easy. And I think you're dealing with kind of traditional ways of working. You're working with professions who have a particular way of doing things. People are exhausted. It's difficult, as we know, to change human behaviour, to drive some of that. We need to look after, if you look at, say, for example, a ward round, you've got a consultant takes the junior doctors around the house. They might make a decision at the beginning of the ward round that somebody needs to be discharged, but they need to see all of those patients. So if they're seeing then 30, 40 patients on the ward round, the junior doctor then has to go back right to the beginning to then do the paperwork for that discharge. You've probably already lost 3 hours. So we've got a responsibility around training junior doctors. So you might say, well, why doesn't the junior doctor stay with that first patient? The problem is then they lose the training opportunity of the other 29 patients.
I mean, I'm sorry, people listening to that will just think, sorry, what? That just seems such a ridiculous way of doing things. Like, why is it like that? That's like from back to the carry on matron days of the NHS.
Sorry, Nick, Hugh's going to rescue me here. I can hear that.
I was going to say that the other point you raised is something as simple as getting medication when you leave from the hospital pharmacy. I've seen this actually personally with a relative. You can get your discharge, but then you've got to have the drugs ready at the pharmacy, and they're overworked, and maybe there's more demand, because the hospitals are very full, and simple pinch points like that. But it probably, one leading London hospital has the pharmacy down in the basement, and there's sort of water dripping in. It's very cramped, so some of it gets back to buildings, and its processes as well. I've seen some positives, and I'm sure, Nick, you've got them at your trust, where NHS staff are working very actively with their social care colleagues to make sure people can be discharged safely, and they're proactively going out into the community, and the NHS is taking more of that on. So I think, that is an important part of the solution. But, we've heard many times this shift of emphasis from the hospital sector to community care. I mean, it sounds fine in theory, but there's quite a lot to be done.
And also, just to end on a sort of a more kind of philosophical note, I'm always struck by that we've heard for a long time now, for decades now, oh, we're an aging society, that's going to have massive consequences for the NHS. But it's then sometimes harder to go to the next step and actually work out what those are going to be. But I just wonder, having the conversation we're having today, okay, influenza is really bad if you're an older person. Do we just have to get used to the fact that there are now going to be permanently, every year, potentially loads more people in hospital with flu because there are loads more older people in the population? We're just going to have to... This isn't going to be a surprise in 10 years' time, 20 years' time. It's going to be life.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's right. Flu goes in these waves. You can have a very small wave or a very big wave, depending on the particular attributes of the virus. Often you get a warning from Australia and it comes round.
Because they had winter earlier. Yeah,
exactly. It comes round. But the point is, it's all to do with very fine margins. If you've got 95% occupancy anyway, which is pretty close to any form of, probably more than any safe level, the margin is so tight. One bad flu year and affecting an elderly population, some of whom haven't had their jabs, is enough to push the whole system really close to sort of red lights flashing.
Yeah.
So I think it's flu, but it's the numbers each year because of the aging population and those very fine margins that can tip it over.
No, I mean, the occupation percentage at Colchester this afternoon is 118%.
How's that possible?
Because we've got patients in corridors.
Oh, I see. Right. Oh, yeah, obviously, yeah.
We've put additional patients onto the ward. So although 95, 98% sounds horrendous, Hugh, I'd certainly take that this evening at Colchester Hospital. So the challenges are real. I think the issue is, if we've talked about shifting care into the community, and there will be some of those patients who can be managed in the community, but we have to put the investment. We know that GPs are completely overrun. We know we're not investing in community services as well. We're not using technology in the way that we could. So I'm hoping that the 10-year plan will not only address those issues, but also put their money where their mouth is. We need to invest out of hospital rather than just thinking that miraculously those services are going to appear and start to look after those sick patients in their own homes or in their care homes or residential homes.
And Nick, I was going to say to you, if you're at 118% now, what's the percentage point that you just, once you reach that, that's kind of game over? But then now thinking back to how the NHS works, there's never a point at which it's game over.
So no,
you're never going to shut the hospital, are you?
No. But the decision that, in fact, we've got a meeting later on this evening again tomorrow to actually look at whether or not we stop our elective care. So we're now at the point where we're going to have to make really difficult decisions about whether or not we stop elective care. Now, 4 years ago, it was a relatively easy decision. People were only waiting 18 weeks. It might add another couple of weeks to their wait. It wasn't massive. But now, when people have been waiting 18 months for their care, cancelling their care now without a guarantee of being able to bring them in, it's a much more significant decision that we're making on behalf of those patients, and the impact on those patients will be huge. So that's the next, in the sense, when you've got the full hospital, the next decision you make is about whether or not you cancel electives. Nobody wants to go there, but it's probably, certainly, as I say, later on this evening and tomorrow morning, that's the conversation I'll be having with senior clinicians across the hospital.
And Nick, are you diverting ambulances? Are you on divert now?
The problem is, Hugh, the only place I can divert is to the other hospital at Ipswich. So it just creates but we do manage that because we're one trust. We are able to divert. So at the moment we're on divert from Colchester to Ipswich. That will very quickly. There's a finite number of obviously patients there, because we just you squeeze the balloon, it comes out somewhere else. So for me, it's more about reducing conveyancing, reducing dispatches. But we do have the luxury of being able to manage some of that demand, certainly across North Essex and Suffolk, because we run the both sites.
And Hugh, just the last question to you, and we might not know the answer to this yet because it will require some research, but you talked about low take-up of vaccines, both for the COVID vaccine and the flu vaccine. Do we know why people just aren't getting them enough? I mean, there's been plenty of kind of communications and advertising by the government and urging people to go and get them. Yeah,
there's been talk of possibly a little more hesitancy. I've not seen any evidence for that necessarily, but I've seen speculation. Are people a little bit more nervous about vaccines? I mean, certainly the fact that Department of Health and NHS England are pushing the vaccine message very hard indeed, the flu vaccine particularly, that there's only a few more days left, certainly in England,
till the end of next week.
Exactly. To go and get it done, that they're obviously very nervous and trying to get the uptake up. There is another issue about should it be compulsory for NHS staff? That's always a very tricky issue, and COVID and flu jabs. I mean, that's another story altogether. But it may be, or a little bit of complacency about it. People are less sort of switched onto the message. But certainly everything I hear from the hospital sector, and I'm sure Nick, is if you're eligible for a flu jab and a COVID jab, go and get them done.
Hugh, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam.
And Nick, I was going to say good luck to you, but that seems like a slightly scary thing to be saying to the chief exec of an NHS trust at the moment, because it's a bit like saying hope isn't good medicine. It's like we shouldn't really be in a situation where we're having to wish you luck.
No, indeed. I mean, luckily I've got amazing colleagues, committed clinicians, so there's a little bit of luck, but luck is never a strategy, and hope isn't a strategy, so we've got a lot of work to do this winter, as ever.
Oh, well, I'll let you get back to work now. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Now, I don't want to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but my entire life as a political journalist, I have been covering governments coming in and saying, we're going to reform the planning system in England so that more local councils say yes to more developments, and particularly new houses being built. The idea being that it means eventually more people might be able to afford to buy a house and get the security that comes with that. And today, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, and Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, have unveiled their attempt to change the planning system. Now, luckily, I know somebody who spends 68.75% of their life looking at the planning system and what local authorities are doing. And she's here now. It's Alex Forsyth from Westminster. Alex, hello.
Hello.
Right, I love a good planning reform because
not as much as me, Adam.
Well, we've lived through quite a few though in our short lives. Where's a good place to start? Because I'm always aware that because planning is like a big whole jigsaw made up of lots of different pieces. So which piece do you want to kind of tell us about first?
Yeah. So should I just tell you
or
a
do you
bit
want to tell
about?
us about the shape? Well, maybe it's the shape. Maybe it's the picture we're trying to make. Not the
maybe it
piece.
is.
Ugh.
All right, so get your head in jigsaw mode, and you're looking for 1.5 million jigsaw pieces, each one looking like a house that the government's promised to build over the next 5 years. And what's happened today is that this is like a really central plank of their bigger picture to try and get to that. So they're making changes to the planning system, so the way that the development gets planning permission. And they've been consulting on these changes for a while. This consultation opened back in the summer, closed in September. They've looked at all the responses and they've said, right, this is what we're going to do. And I think the really key points to pull out, just the kind of headlines, is that they are sticking to this idea that councils in England are going to have higher mandatory housing targets that they have to meet, slightly tweaked, so slightly higher in London and the South East, slightly lower elsewhere than was proposed in the summer. But across the board, this means overall much higher housing targets. And the government's pretty clear that if councils aren't playing ball or getting on board, they're prepared to intervene, step in. And the other big bit of this is that the government's saying, to help you try and meet those targets, what we're saying is, if you can't find enough land in your neck of the woods that's been previously built on, you're going to have to look at the green belt. So that's the protected land between big urban conurbations. And you're going to have to look at that, try and find some poor quality green belt, what they're calling grey belt, and get building on that instead. But you've got to meet these targets.
Jigsaw Puzzler of the Year goes to Alex Forsyth. That was amazing. Right, let's look at some of the individual elements there. So the mandatory housing targets for local authorities in England, like the two things that jump to mind when I hear that are how mandatory are they? In other words, what happens if X shire council doesn't hit the targets? And second of all, I mean, local authorities build social housing, but they don't build most of the houses that are built. So actually, they're responsible for a target that they really only contribute to in quite a minor way.
Yeah. So this is where it gets really complicated, but I'll do my best not to make it so. So they are mandatory targets. So the government's being really clear about that. So what happens is, the way it works is that what a council has to do is come up with what's called a local plan. That's basically a massive document where they have to identify enough land in their area that could provide certain number of homes. So these targets, what the councils have to do is draw up these local plans and say, we reckon we could build that many homes there, that many homes there, that many homes there, that many homes there. The total's going to add up to our target. So therefore, when developers come forward and want planning permission, the council goes, yep, that fits in with our plan, you can build that, and then it gets built. That's the idea. And what the government's saying is that if councils don't do that, they don't come up with plans and identify land that can meet these targets, the government can step in. And there's a whole process involved, but basically the government can decide that they're going to take control and set that plan for the local council, decide what land's going to be built on in a local area at government level. But they're also pointing out something else, saying that if you don't have one of these plans in place, what it means is that because of the complexities of the system, it's more likely that when developers come forward and say, we want to build over there on that bit of land, they're going to get permission because there's not like a structure in place that says you can build there, you can't build there. So I think that they are the sort of interventions that the government's talking about, and they're really, really clear they're prepared to use them because they want councils to meet these targets. But you're completely right, councils don't build homes. They do have that key role in allowing development to take place, planning permission, but for the most part they don't build these big private developments, of course. And that's what councils are pushing back on slightly, saying, look, it's all well and good having these targets and planning permissions and all the rest of it. That on its own won't get homes built. You also got to look at infrastructure, you've got to look at the construction sector. You know, those kind of things matter when it comes to whether or not these homes are actually going to be delivered.
And then the other thing you mentioned about this new idea of the grey belt, so bits of the green belt that aren't particularly pretty or particularly green or particularly useful in maintaining a nice environment. Do we know what the definition of grey belt is going to be? Or maybe they'll keep it quite loose and it'll be up to individual local authorities to decide. And this is more of a sort of kind of creating a new framework as opposed to specifying something really precisely.
Yeah, well, they've had a go at defining this a bit more clearly, because when they first came up with this phrase, as if we didn't have enough jargon to deal with, but when they first came up with this grey belt phrase, there were a lot of people going, hang about, you know, that's actually quite subjective. That could mean lots of different things in lots of different places. And the thing that you'll hear ministers say again and again is things like, you know, disused car parks or petrol stations or bits of scrubland. But the truth is, not every area will have those things in its green belt that it can look at and go, aha, that looks like obvious grey belt to me. So they've had a go at defining it, and they're making clear it's kind of underused or poor quality greenbelt. And what they're saying is basically land that doesn't do what it's supposed to do, which is stop urban sprawl and, as you say, have all those environmental protections in place. But they have also said they're going to come up with a bit more of a definition next year, because I think there is still some confusion about this, and more importantly perhaps exactly when this should be applied, i.e. what bits of the greenbelt really should be considered for development.
And I'm glad you said the phrase urban sprawl as a former geographer. Well, actually, no, you're always a geographer, I think.
Once
it's a lifetime thing.
Always a
exactly,
geographer.
It's a lifetime thing. Is that the greenbelt? I mean, sometimes you think the greenbelt is like, oh, it's almost like every town having its own like national park around the edges so that it's all beautiful and lovely. And actually, that's not necessarily what the greenbelt is designed to do. It's designed to constrain the size and the footprint of urban development, which is why you can have a bit of greenbelt that does not look like a beautiful rolling set of hills, but it's actually technically still doing its job under the original legislation which created it.
Yeah, exactly. That's absolutely spot on. Some people get it. I mean, it is so jargony. It's so jargony. But, you know, green field is different to green belt. Green field might be somewhere that's never been developed. You know, villages, rural villages that have got beautiful countryside around them, that's not necessarily green belt land. It is a really specific thing in planning terms, exactly as you say, to stop particularly the big cities just sprawling out and becoming one big blob of development. It's like a protective ring around the big urban centres, and it's there specifically for that reason. So it isn't always beautiful rolling green hills, although sometimes it is.
And in terms of the political reaction to this, I see the opposition parties have basically sort of reverted to the type that they need to revert to for the next election, which is you've got the Liberal Democrats doing a classic Liberal Democrat response, which is this is really bad for local democracy. Any whiff of central government stepping in and demanding that councils do this is taking away the rights of local people to object to things, and perhaps Lib Dem councillors to say no to things. And then you've got the Tories saying, oh, this is a war on rural England because they need to win loads more seats back in rural England.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say that there's no great surprise in any of the responses from the opposition. And I think it's also probably important to note that actually when you talk to lots of people from lots of parties at local government level, but also MPs and within the government itself, there is a lot of support for the idea of getting more homes built. You know, I don't think there's very many people that say, oh, no, we don't want any more development at all. Everything's fine in the housing market. You know, you've just got to look at people on housing waiting lists and temporary accommodation, people struggling to get on the ladder, high rents. You know, there is a sort of political consensus that development is needed and necessary. Obviously, where it gets contentious is where that development goes, what it looks like, you know, how many homes in an area. That gets a lot more complicated. And there are also some people, and this is from local authorities as well, who raise the points about, hang about, why don't you put more effort, government, into forcing developers to build out, you know, get the houses built on the planning permissions that they've already got?
Yeah, because there's loads of houses in theory that could be built right now that just aren't.
Exactly. And the government is doing some work on this. Another technical phrase called the Homes Accelerator Programme, where they're trying to get some of those sites which are sitting there with planning permission built. But there are others that say you could do a whole lot more, and that would go a long way to getting their higher housing numbers. There are also some people that talk about things like empty homes, you know, focus on that first. And of course, then there's the issue about whether or not there's enough affordable and social housing planned in all of these grand schemes. So it's like a really, really complicated picture. And this isn't the end of it by any means. You know, there's another bill coming forward next year. They're planning an infrastructure bill, and there are other kind of bits of work going on in government as well. But I think the reason this really matters is because this framework, this like planning rules framework, is the central thing that councils, who are so key in approving developments, are going to have to work off. And the government's being really clear about what it wants. Lots more homes, pretty much everywhere. Councils crack on with it. And I think what's going to be really interesting is to see whether councils do really push back, and then whether or not all of this leads to those homes actually being built, because of course that's what really matters.
I mean, colour me sceptical, but I just remember as a baby political reporter, and you will remember too, do you remember Eric Pickles?
Oh, I do.
The infamous Conservative community secretary. I remember him right at the start of David Cameron and Nick Clegg's administration saying the key to this is forcing councils to come up with a local plan and being really strict with them, that if you don't come up with a local plan and decide locally where you're going to build all these houses and all this infrastructure, we, central government, will step in and make you do it. And here we are 14 years later with a press release, a lot of which is similar content.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any shortage of a politician willing to don a hard hat and a high vis and head to a building site and talk about building more homes and all the ways that they want to do it. But the challenges in the system are not to be underestimated. You know, and it isn't just as, and I think there is a recognition of this, to be fair, that there's no sort of silver bullet to this by any stretch of the imagination. You know, it is going to rely on lots of different things coming together. And of course, there's an element of the market coming into play in this as well, because it is private developers who deliver a lot of the kind of housing that the government's talking about. So it's such a statement of the obvious. I'm almost reluctant to say it, Adam, but you know, it's one of those things that plans are one thing, but delivery is the thing that really matters. And I do think that there is, just having spent a lot of time talking to councils who are obviously at the sort of key end of all this, I do think that there is a sort of element about whether or not this is actually really achievable, the scale the government's talking about, because you've got to remember the targets that they've set for annual house building are way higher than anything that's actually been delivered in recent decades.
Well, yeah, because as you were saying at the start of this conversation, so the Labour target is now, 370,000 homes a year
in England.
And the Conservative target in the previous government was 300,000, and they never hit that.
They never hit that. And in fact, this is off the top of my head, but I think the most recent was around 220,000 homes were completed. So to ramp up to where the government says it wants to be, I mean, that is a really big jump, and it hasn't happened for an awfully long time. And I mean, they do acknowledge that. The Housing Minister, Matthew Pennycook, has said this is going to be challenging, perhaps even more challenging than initially they'd first thought. But the tone and everything that they've been talking about today about these planning reforms is that they're utterly convinced that this is the thing to do, and they're utterly convinced that this is the way to do it. And of course, politically, why this really matters is because Keir Starmer's put this so high up his own agenda. You know, this is one of the things in his plan for change, his big mission to build 1.5 million homes over the Parliament. So, and he said in his own words, judge us by whether or not we reach those targets. So they've sort of staked a lot on this, not just because they genuinely believe that these homes are needed to help for all the reasons we've talked about with people struggling with housing, but also, of course, they see it as a bit of a driver for economic growth, which they're really trying to achieve. So they've put a lot on this, and this is a really key moment in terms of what they're actually planning to do about it. I'm not even going to say the words, we'll wait and see. But, you know, I think that's really all we can do, is just see whether or not you start to see more homes as a result.
Alex, thank you very much.
Pleasure as ever.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thanks to everyone who's been on it, and thanks to you too for listening. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye.